are aware. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Sean, I'll keep an eye on the chat and the room, but let's dive into our roundtable for today. My name is Melissa Sadorf. I'm the superintendent of the Stanfield Elementary School District located in Pinal County, and I also serve as the president of the Arizona Rural Schools Association, and just very glad that you are here with us today. Sean Rickert.
Good morning. My name is Sean Rickert, and I am the superintendent of the Pima Unified School District over in Graham County in the Gila Valley. I am also the president-elect of the Arizona Rural Schools Association, and glad that you could join us for this auspicious occasion. You know, we've done a couple of these January roundtables, and it always seems like this time of year, the concerns and apprehensions of superintendents turn towards, Phoenix and what's going on in the legislature. And so that's where we're going to kind of turn our attention today. Want to introduce a new face in the legislative offices, not a new face to education policy, and someone that most of you, I think, have probably met in one capacity or next in just a minute. But Melissa, you want to wrap up any other housekeeping items before we get into today's program?
Sure. Remember that we really do want this to be a free-flowing conversation. So once Mr. McCarthy has given us some background information about what we're going to be talking about today, please feel free to either put questions in the chat. I'll be monitoring that, or unmute, and let's have a conversation around what our topics of discussion are going to be today. So please feel free to be a full participant in our conversation this morning.
Absolutely. So, all right. So, one of the key issues that faces schools right now is this question about the aggregate expenditure limit. And I know that each and every one of you has been receiving emails from Chuck Essigs and from ASA and from ASBA and, oh gosh, maybe Guppy Mac, or maybe from a lot of different sources providing information about the threat that is the aggregate expenditure limit. And so when Melissa and I were discussing what a good topic would be, we felt like this would be someplace that we could go. And as we were considering who to bring in as kind of a thought expert, as an area expert to share this, as well as be able to share any other insights about any other legislative policy questions you might have, my mind instantly went to Sean McCarthy. Now, you may remember Sean used to sit on the school facilities board. He was on the SFB there for it seemed like forever, but I'm sure it wasn't.
It did 5 years.
5 years.
Yeah.
And was instrumental in increasing the accountability within that program, as well as making sure that the funds that the legislature approved for school construction went to projects that made a difference. We appreciate his service there. He also spent a number of years working with the Arizona Tax Reform Association, otherwise known as ATRA, again in education policy, and looking at ways that the laws pertaining to school finance affects taxpayers. And since we're all taxpayers at heart, his work there was trying to look out for our best interests, although sometimes it did seem to run a little bit askew of what schools wanted, because anytime that you're trying to reform taxes, there's always the possibility that schools will see changes to their revenue streams, and so some of what's been done at ATRA isn't always received as well by superintendents. But I think I appreciate the fact that there's always been an openness in communication, and the information that we've received from ATRA, the analysis that they've provided, looking at things like bonds and overrides has always been valuable. I also value, the fact that from a rural perspective, there's always been that conversation about the fact that a system, an education finance system that relies heavily on secondary tax rate funded projects isn't terribly equitable, especially for your rural districts, because the tax burden that I would have to place on taxpayers in Pima to generate enough finances to do any significant construction is much, much higher than the secondary tax burden that we placed on taxpayers in, say, Cave Creek or even another rural community that has a power plant or another big finance. So those kinds of issues are the kinds of things that Sean has worked to raise awareness of over the last years. Now he's transitioned to a new position in the legislature. Some of you may have worked with Kelsey Yance over the last, and she'd been there for at least 5 years. She's moved on, and Sean has stepped into that role as the Education Policy Analyst for the Arizona House of Representatives, working closely with Chairwoman Udall and Speaker Bowers as they work to find ways to strengthen education policy in Arizona. And so based on that expertise, I really value his insights into the AEL issue, and we've invited him to kind of come and share a little. He's going to share a little bit with us on some history and what the current political landscape looks like as far as the situation goes. And then again, we really encourage you as roundtable participants to share your questions with Sean, because it can help you get information, but it can also help him to understand what your concerns are, and and he's a great conduit to get those concerns back to the speaker and the chairwoman. So with that, Sean, what can you tell us?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Rupert. I appreciate the introduction. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Sean McCarthy, the Senior Policy Advisor for House Majority staff now, working for Speaker Bowers, and brand new to this role, still learning it. Definitely not an expert in all things education, so I'm learning every day here. I do have a strong background in school finance, and so that's where I'm most comfortable talking, but I am doing my best to learn all of the other various areas of education policy. I'm a native Arizonan, born and raised. I grew up in Chandler, Gilbert area, and attended a small high school. So I spent my high school days traveling all around rural Arizona, playing sports against rural Arizona teams and stuff. So I'm very proud of rural Arizona. Spent a lot of time in rural Arizona. So deep affinity for the rural parts of Arizona. So I'd like to think that over my career, we spent an inordinate amount of time thinking about the impacts of fiscal policy on or rural Arizona, just because we knew that wasn't always going to be something that people had the brain power to think about. So we tried to, when I was at ACHA, tried to make up for that by always considering the various impacts. And that's what the members wanted while I was there, was for us to really consider about the hyper local impacts that sometimes you can take into account. So I'd like to think that you got a friendly in me on consideration of rural issues. I'd like to think that I take kind of an investor's view in K-12, and so not a management view. So like Sean said, we definitely not always agree on stuff. But as an investor, I feel like schools demand resources, and we want to make sure the product is good, right? And so we understand it requires resources, it requires attention, and we want to make sure that it's working for all the stakeholders involved. So definitely don't try to think that I'm taking an adversarial role. I'd like to think that I care a lot about what you do and how it works. All right, so let's dive right into the aggregate expenditure limit. So for those of you who aren't real well versed in it, I'll just do some quick history. So of course, in the late 1970s, there are taxpayer revolts going around the country, most famously Prop 13 in California, which instituted a 1% total cap limitation on all property taxes for all taxpayers in California. And that really undermined the ability to access the property tax in California. So lawmakers in Arizona are diving under their desk, worried that same thing was going to happen in Arizona, because there was an effort to do the same thing in Arizona. So they beat them to the ballot. They got a series of reforms placed in the ballot in 1980, in June of 1980, and everything in Arizona public finance wise now goes back to 1980 because of that June 1980 ballot referral. They did a lot of different things that some of you may be familiar with, particularly as it relates to limitations to access to property tax, like the levy limitations that pretty much all governments have, from cities, community colleges, counties, etc. So they also created these things called expenditure limitations, and they created them for cities and counties and community college districts. They weren't really sure how to manage school districts because at the time school districts were spending a variety of different amounts of money. So there really wasn't any kind of like thoughtful way to deal with it, other than what they came up with in the middle of the night. And if you talk to the folks who are around, it wasn't like something that got discussed for a particularly long time. So instead of creating a district by district expenditure limitation, the way they have for counties and towns and cities, they just created an aggregate and said, all right, we're just going to create an aggregate amount. And so the total amount of state and local spending, and with some exemptions, are going to be subject to these expenditure limits that would grow by population and inflation. In 1986, they referred to the voters a 10% increase that bumped it by 10%, which actually is if you look at the total amount, it's actually a considerable bump in the total spend. And then in 2002, voters approved to exempt the Prop 301, the classroom site fund revenues that are generated from that 0.6% sales tax. So those are the two times that voters have addressed the AEL statewide. And then in 2007, 8, and 9, the schools were going to exceed the aggregate expenditure limit. However, in 2000, so the legislature voted in 07 and 08. They didn't end up needing to vote in 09 because of the recession, pulled back budget money. So two different times in recent history, the legislature has overridden a single year budget that was about to exceed the AEL. So there's obviously some uniqueness to it. Stuff like local spending, your bonds and overrides don't count. Stuff that pays for debt service don't count. So there's a series of exceptions. No charter money counts. A judge ruled many years ago that because charter school money is passed along to essentially a private entity, that was beyond the scope of the AEL that was created before charter. So interestingly enough, there's none of that money counts. And if you were to put all of the charter spend within the cap, you would also bring in their ADM. So I'm not exactly sure what would happen to it, but it's something that gets talked around here as far as being kind of a peculiarity of the system at this point. So it obviously doesn't get discussed every year, because if you're not exceeding the cap, then it just doesn't really get talked about. But every single year, the Department of Revenue makes this calculations through the EEC, the Economic Estimates Commission, and they figure out what the prior year student count was, and they run it through their calculator. They multiply it against the change in inflation times the change in population, and that spits out what the aggregate expenditure cap is going to be. So for fiscal 22, the estimate is about 7.2 billion. And if you, or excuse me, the 6.6 billion, and the total expenditures that are estimated to be subject to the AEL is 7.2, which leaves the state about $1.2 billion over the expenditure limit. So there's a variety of reasons why we're over the expenditure limit this year. Spending is up, ADM is pretty stagnant, even down a little bit, and then of course the education sales tax monies were ruled by the Supreme Court, to be within the bounds, and that's because the Prop 301 is no longer voter protected, and so they said that because it's no longer now it's statutorily authorized, that the exemption is no longer authorized, because the exemption in the Constitution says for a voter approved tax. And since Prop 301 is no longer voter approved, it's statutorily approved by the legislature. They said that you can't, the legislature cannot just decide which revenues count and which don't. It has to be within the bounds of the Constitution. So that constitutional issue obviously makes it quite a bit more challenging from a day-to-day management standpoint. And of course, the AEL is the primary reason why Proposition 208 was the revenues were ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court within Prop 208, which is kind of a weird confluence of events, right? There's like a whole lot of things going on at once. And so the Supreme Court said, look, provided that these monies will exceed the expenditure limit, then the voters were not making a choice with the full knowledge, full awareness that these monies could not be freely spent by the schools, and therefore I'm going to kick it down to a lower court to do the math and ensure that yes, these Prop 208 revenues would put the schools above the AEL, and so it's the final fate of 208 now rests with a lower court, and so the operative question right now is what's going on? Is the legislature going to override the expenditure limit for the current fiscal year that we're in, or what's the delay? And I think it's pretty well understood at this point that the legislature has a vested interest in having the judge make that decision without the vacuum of a heated political discussion going on at the Capitol as to what is happening with AEL. A lot of folks have said none of that matters because this is supposed to be for fiscal 23, but the lawyers for the legislature have said, no, it does matter. And so we really would encourage you to pause and just let this judge make this decision without dealing with this first. And so I don't think I'm speaking out of line by saying if you're wondering why you're not hearing as much out of the majority, it has to do with what our lawyers have told us is to wait and to see what comes out of this lower court ruling on 208. I'll pause there because I saw some questions.
Do we have a date on when you expect that lower court decision, Sean?
It's any day, Mr. Rickert. We don't know for sure. The state has asked that there be a ruling by January 21 because the taxes are now due for for calendar year 21. So if you would have owed on Prop 208 the tax in last year, you now have to start thinking about how much you're going to owe. You didn't have to withhold last year because it was the first year, so there was no withholding.
Right.
But now there is withholding because you're into 22. And if you would have owed last year, you have to start withholding or making your quarterly estimated payments. So taxpayers now are really in a bind because the courts have not ruled. So the Department of Revenue said, hey, we need a decision by January 21 so we can print the forms for the 21 filing. And so we can tell people how much they should start withholding or paying in estimated payments. And the judge acknowledged that and said, I hear you. I hear that you would like a ruling. Hasn't come out yet, but people are kind of hopeful that it could be soon. So that obviously the clock is ticking. The legislature is very aware of the deadlines and is very understanding of what would mean if it would miss a deadline. I will tell you that there are a lot of options, and the lawyers are talking through the various options as to how it might be dealt with. And so my sort of message to you is that the legislature is not unaware of the looming threat, the issue, the scope of it. 1.2 billion statewide is obviously a tremendous amount of money. And I don't think that they are numb to it or ignorant to the scope of the problem. So that's sort of my pitch. And that's what I've pretty much told everybody who's asked me about the AEL. So I don't think I'm telling you anything different than I've tried to tell other folks who've asked. So with that, I'll pause for any questions on AEL issues.
So let's say worst case scenario, this gets tied up in the budget process where people are feeling like they can hold out their vote on the AEL increase to try to get something in the final budget that that they think is going to be contentious, or any other bill, I guess, for that matter. There's a timeline for school districts as far as, I mean, if the legislature doesn't take action by the 1st of March, which, is only, I mean, it's 4 weeks, which means that really, what is that? 20 days of legislative action. I mean, counting the holiday, but between now and then, I mean, so if we get to that point on March 1st, is there is the sky going to fall, or is this something that the legislature eventually has to take up because the funds have already been budgeted? And
The
even if
legislature doesn't have many opportunities to claw back the money. The original Prop 301 and subsequent Prop 123, it makes it so that the state has to pay for inflation adjustments. And so I don't think the state could adopt a new budget for fiscal 22 and then revert those monies from ADE. So I think just from a technical standpoint, it would be pretty difficult for the state to, now there's probably some monies that the state could claw back that are not protected if it so chose. But I think it would be difficult for a variety of reasons, both technical and political. So I think it's more of just a how the sausage is made kind of question. This could be done in a matter of hours at the legislature. It would not take a ton of time, and 4 weeks is a long time in a legislative session. There's a lot of, so lawmakers are not that nervous from a timeline perspective. I recognize that that's convenient for us to say because we're not the ones having to manage the school budget, but I think in their minds they are they're sitting tight, waiting for what their lawyers have advised them on. And so I don't know what else to say other than they hear what you're saying and they understand your concern. I can't speak for everyone or how they're all thinking, but I would have a hard time thinking that there'd be a lot of people that would want to see a school district bloodbath at the end of the semester. Like I have a hard time sort of seeing that. I think it really becomes, like you mentioned, a how the sausage is made type of thing. I think one strategy that you could try is to ask lawmakers to view this in isolation and say, hey, look, I realize there's a lot of things in K-12 world that you have interest in, and there's a lot of policy on the table. There is a lot of reform ideas on the table, and I think there's a lot of opportunity for negotiations on stuff. But if you overly complicate this with the looming timeline, you make this harder to get done. And so you could ask people to try to narrowly focus on this issue without tying it up inside of to other negotiations. That's one strategy. I know a lot of folks have talked about long-term AEL fixes, whether it be ballot referrals to exempt certain amounts of revenue or a base reset. You could reset the 1980 base to just create some long-term runway. There's a lot of options for longer term future fiscal year issues. That's probably going to be a lot more subject to negotiation and other types of, okay, what do we get back type of thing. So one technique would be say, hey, look, happy to negotiate on that front, but we just don't see the timeline to attach this to other policy battles. And I've seen folks in your community make that request, and I think that's pretty reasonable. Other thoughts or questions on AEL?
So, if anybody else has a question, I'm just trying to, plumb the depths of my mind to see if there's anything I can come up with in the hopes that that's also things other people are wondering about. But you'd mentioned the fact that part of what created this problem is the changes to the classroom site fund that resulted from transitioning from it being the Proposition 301 instituted classroom site fund to being the Coleman bill extension of Proposition 301 that we saw pass the legislature a couple of years back. So, and that part of that issue involves the fact that the voter approval from 2002 to increase the AEL to cover 301 funding is kind of, expired with the end of the 301 classroom site fund. So how much of this has also got to do with the fact that, we're now seeing a significant increase in how much of the funding from the class, is going into the classroom site fund from the educational sales tax, because the bonds
about
are paying
half.
off. And I mean, so
Yeah,
that's
it's about half of the problem is associated with that. Because it's about 600 to 700 million is from the classroom site fund. And again, it wasn't that in 202 they raised the AEL. In 202, the voters exempted voter-approved sales tax dollars.
okay.
That's exactly what the Constitution reads. So when it no longer became voter-approved, there's now no longer a voter-approved sales tax for K-12. And so and frankly, it just really wasn't discussed that much at the time when they were going to do the legislative reauthorization. Schools were under the AEL at that time. And I don't know how much policymakers were even thinking about that, but that is one possibility. For a long-term resolution would be to exempt more revenues like the classroom site fund from the AEL, which would reduce the problem. It wouldn't fix it though. So that in and of itself is not going to bring schools underneath the cap long-term.
Okay. So if the judge rules that the Proposition 208 funding is voter approved funding and is exempted from the AEL because of that 2002, does that solve the problem, or does that solve part of the problem?
Now the judge isn't reviewing. That's not within the scope of the lower court's ruling.
Okay.
Yeah, that the Supreme Court's already sort of dealt with that part of it. The 2002 is for a sales tax. So 208 wouldn't fall into that. Yeah.
What were they thinking leaving that out, right?
The drafters obviously stepped on a pretty sizable rake when they drafted it to try to notwithstand the Constitution in a statutory bill puts a big red blinking light on your bill. It's not, and they were warned by legislative counsel that you can't notwithstand the Constitution. So,
right.
Here we are.
I mean, back before Proposition 208 passed on the ballot, I know we had a large discussion in this forum about the pros and cons and the reasons why it wasn't necessarily the approach to school finance that most of us were seeking, but it was the only option on the table at the time. So here we go now, seeing all the reasons why the problems that we'd anticipated are creating additional problems that are scaffolding. So doesn't seem to be any other questions about AEL. Talk to us a little bit about the tuition.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. So House Bill 2124. This is a UDOL bill. This was brought to the legislature by the county school superintendents. I see Tim Carter is on the call, and so I'm hoping to see him later today in the House Education Committee. It's going to be heard this afternoon in House Education. And so for years, there's been discussion of how to try to get rid of this legacy funding system where 03 elementary districts that are not in the high school district could get away from paying tuition out for their high schoolers that are now going to high school in another district. It's obviously very different from how things work, particularly in urban areas where almost every area offers high school services. And if you offer high school services in your district, then you don't have to pay tuition out. The students just open enroll. And so it's really a fairly small subset within the grand scheme of Arizona school finance, the number of students that are being tuitioned out. But for common school districts, it is a bit of a headache to try to figure out, who they're paying to what and the differences in the cost. And it is a bit of a hindrance to open enrollment in rural areas because of those cost differentials. And arguably, it is something that is limiting parents exploring all of their options, often because schools direct students, hey, this is, these are the 1 or 2 high schools we prefer you go to, that type of thing. So it's not only not particularly a modern setup within how Arizona schools are funded, but it does create some problems at the margins. So the county school soups came to Miss Udall, and then we've been working with them on this legislation. But it's definitely complicated to try to figure it out. The biggest reason why this has never gone away is because if you don't have high school services and you're not paying tuition out, then your qualifying tax rate on the 9 through 12 side would theoretically go to 0, because of course the way the school tax laws work is you levy either the qualifying tax rate or the amount to fund your equalization base. Well, if you have no equalization base and you have no tuition out on the 9 through 12 side, then that would go to 0. You would only have a K through 8 tax. And so I think historically it was argued, well, that's not fair. There are high schoolers from that area. They should have to pay their fair share, and ergo the tuition out model, right? And so what this does, this bill pretty much wipes out tuition for high school students from your O3 districts, and instead says that the taxpayers within that O3 district are going to levy the lesser of the qualifying tax rate on the high school side, the lesser of that, or the equalization base for the average cost for the number of high schoolers they have. So it says the countywide average equalization base multiplied by the number of high schoolers you have, and that becomes the equalization base. So the idea behind this bill is to not rock the boat too much. The schools that are doing the attendance, instead of receiving tuition, they will just generate ADM for those students, just like they would if that high schooler came from a district that provided high school services. So they will just count all their students as ADM wherever they are attending for the high schoolers. And then the sending district will generate a normal tax rate that'll probably be fairly similar to what they're doing today. And instead of paying that out in tuition, onesie-twosie to the high schoolers, that money will just go to the county as a state aid dollar, and it'll go into the SETR bucket, the state equalization tax rate, which of course is the first dollar in for state aid into the school districts within that county. And so it just becomes state aid dollars for the county. So it doesn't go to the state general fund. It'll stay local. We thought that that was the cleanest way to make sure that taxpayers are still paying their fair share within the O3 district. And then the districts that are teaching them will treat everybody the same. There's obviously some complications there. One of them is transportation. If you're the sending district, you can generate route miles from the students within your district if you're sending them to high school. This bill still allows you to generate route miles for your high schoolers. If you're a receiving a high school district, you can still count route miles if they're going to pick them up. But there's obviously the limitations in law about the 30-mile drive limit unless they are qualified for free and reduced price lunch or they have an IEP. So if there are any high schools that are currently driving farther than 30 miles to go get them, that might be something lawmakers need to hear about. I think that's already the law, so I'm not sure. Another question is as it relates to tuition out debt service, right? So the state equalizes a very small portion, like $150 a student on that. And then the rest becomes a special primary levy that gets attached to the tuition that goes to the attending school district if they're paying off loans. This is a pretty de minimis amount of money statewide if you look at the totals, but I could see a world where for a small school district, that small amount of money was real money to them, right? And so if there's any schools that are like, hey, we really have been counting on this debt service money that's coming from this O3 district, then that's something lawmakers need to hear about as well. As I looked through district by district, The only one that has a real significant amount of debt service coming in is from Nottaburg, and that's only for one more year because they're going to start offering high school services for all 4 grade years. So that's turning off anyhow. That's going to be kind of the same. So I don't think it's going to create huge problems for anybody by that going away. But if it does, we need to know about it. I think it does because if you got bonds approved, that was on the value of the property in your district. You were not even able to put those funds up as collateral to the bondholders anyhow, because that's not guaranteed. So that's my suspicion. But if I'm wrong on that, then we need to know. So I'm sure that was clear as mud. I'm happy to stand for questions about what it does or any issues you might have.
Howard, did you have a question?
I did. And thank you, Sean. I appreciate your kind of going through this and helping us to understand it. So it sounds like the debt service obviously would be a challenge, and then override, they wouldn't, collect on that as well, because again, this is like a open enrollment student. So,
but they would generate ADM in your district of its own.
Right.
So they would locally generate override dollars as the RCL goes up.
Okay, I see. Yes, got it. Okay.
Which there could be some complaining there too. I could hear some folks saying, "Hey, our taxpayers weren't paying for that override, and now they are," which is always the case in open enrollment. It's not the perfect design feature in our system, but there's really no way to make sense of it. And so I'm hoping that it's small enough numbers that it's not going to shock any taxpayers.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the key issue there is that it's not that you can't collect it, it's a matter of who pays for it. Right. And in the old system, that might have been, a part of that tuition cost. Yeah, the same with the debt service, which would have enabled the receiving district to be able to collect that revenue. So with that, then I also understand that there would be a certificate of educational convenience that would dictate where kids go. So do the receiving districts then, in working with their county superintendents, have the choice to accept those kids or not? And can you explain how that piece would work? I think that might help people as well.
Yeah, that's a good question. That wasn't one that we tackled when we were originally drafting it, but it did come up the other day. Right now in 15.816, it says that basically your unifieds are required to accept open enrollment, and that doesn't really extend to kids coming from the 03 districts. And so I think the legislature is going to have to determine if they want to just make it mandatory, like, hey, you need to just accept any comers. I think in this day and age, that would be less controversial than it might have been some other time. I think for the most part, districts want these students if this is a net benefit to them. So I have a hard time imagining high school districts saying, "Hey, I don't want to play here. I want to be able to say no." That's my hunch, but I think that you may have to have an amendment to this bill that opens up 816 and says that you have to accept the 03 students without a CEC. Does anybody see any problems with that?
Yeah, I think that I would agree with you that most districts probably are not going to be in a position of saying no. I mean, when you look at districts that might have been collecting on the, the debt service and the, and looking at the override issue, that kind of thing in terms of who pays, you'd have that issue, but you have it anyway when you're looking at open enrollment. So if you're accepting open enrollment at that high school level, you're already dealing with that. And I think with, open enrollment, becoming a bigger and bigger thing, I assume that won't be a huge issue, but maybe for some it would. So that's why I wanted to just clarify that, because I'm guessing that a lot of folks won't understand, how that might have worked, and I don't know if they would want to weigh in on that piece. So.
Thank you. That's a good point.
Thank you so much, Howard. Anything else? Anybody else has? So, Sean, I know we've used up more of your time than we'd originally planned, and I appreciate your spending the time with us. If I could just ask you about one more issue, and it's a Senate continuing resolution. So I don't know if this one's come up on your radar yet, but since it has to do with school funding and taxes, I think it seems like it might be in your wheelhouse. But Senate continuing resolution, 1007, that pertains to basically using it appears to set up it's kind of a tax credit of sorts for property taxes, allowing taxpayers to apply their property tax to a private school instead of a public school. And I wasn't sure if you heard any of the details on that one. I mean, again, continuing resolutions sometimes are intentionally vague, but notwithstanding any provision of the legislature by law may allow property owners in the state to allocate the amount of school district property taxes levied and assessed against the property owner's primary residence to a private school in the state.
Yeah, I have no idea what that's about. I haven't looked into it. I just read it as you were talking it through.
Okay.
That's obviously a constitutional change, which would require a public vote and would be deeply complicated. I don't know. That probably needs a bill to effectuate the statutory policy as well. So there's probably an accompanying bill out there. So yeah, I don't really want to comment any further on it to say that it hasn't really got going just yet. But my sort of professional advice would be I wouldn't lose any sleep over it.
Excellent.
And now I'll probably get in trouble for saying that. So
Well,
I'm still learning my job on what I'm supposed to say.
no, I think that's obviously.
Before I let you guys go, I wanted to make a quick plug for my book that I wrote when I was at ATRA. It was the last thing I did. It's called Arizona School Finance. It's like a 100-page book it's a nonpartisan, just straight up, here's how it works kind of book. And it's got a lot of history and facts and data, and it's just tons of like helpful historical charts and stuff. So if you have any kind of like new admins or whatever, people in the business office, ATRA has copies. If you head up to Phoenix and you swing by ATRA, there's physical copies in there. The physical copy is really useful. It's also available on Amazon as an ebook as well, but the physical copies there. So anyway, I thought you guys.
So the title is just Arizona School Finance.
Yeah, if you just Google Arizona School Finance on Amazon, it's available as an ebook. But the physical copy is I don't know. I like being able to just flip to stuff and find the chart I'm looking for. But there is an ebook available as well. So just wanted to throw that out there.
And Sean, what's the cost?
So I think it's $40.
Thank you. Sounds like a good resource. Thank
And
you.
if they say they heard about it here, they get a discount, or they.
Well, I know some people have been buying them in bulk, and so that I think is negotiable. If you call Kevin at ATRA and ask him how many you wanted, it's pretty much. We're not exactly like an official business, so it's all subject to negotiation. But
Yeah.
a couple of groups that have bought bulk numbers of them, so I don't know how they worked out. I just wrote it. I don't make anything off of it. All the money goes to ATRA, so I wrote it on staff time, so that's fair. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well,
Doesn't look like there are any other questions. Just a real quick note. Keep in mind that every Tuesday at 2 o'clock, both the House and Senate Ed committees meet. And so if you have time to go to azledge.gov and you can listen in on those conversations around the bills that are up for discussion. For those of you that are not yet registered for the request to speak system and you would like to be registered, that needs to be done in person down at the Capitol building, and Wes Brownfield, our executive director, is very happy to do that for you. If you would please either email him directly, or you could email me or Sean, And we'll be happy to make sure that you're set up in the RTS system so that you can weigh in on the different bills that are being heard in those subcommittee hearings.
Exactly. And yes, you taking some time to look in on what's coming up on those agendas. So as Melissa said, the meetings are on Tuesdays, so the agendas are usually available. I don't know, when do those get published, Sean? I want to say, I know they're available on, but
The meeting agenda is published the day after the meeting that week, usually in the evening. So we meet on Tuesday, so they usually come out at like 5 or 6 p.m. on Wednesdays. And then any amendments are due the day before at noon. So, but yeah, usually people kind of will look out for it Wednesday evening. We turn it in by 5.
Great. Thank you.
I can tell you that next week we are going to be focusing on adult education, workforce development, and dual enrollment. So those will be the topics for next week. So stay tuned.
Great. And Howard just noted the summaries are available on Friday or Monday. Is that correct?
Yeah, they're typically out on Friday. Some of them, sometimes they're even available earlier than that, depending on when our research staff can get them out. But yeah, should be available no later than Friday afternoon on the summaries. But I would really encourage you to crack open the actual bill and look through it too, because the summaries don't always cover everything, and you may have a different view, particularly with stuff like the tuition out. I mean, there's like probably 5 people in the whole state who could explain that bill. It's just deeply complicated. So,
Well, if there are no other questions, and I'm looking at the chat and I don't see anything.
I do need to run. Thank you for having me. I appreciate your time. Best of
Thank
luck.
you, Sean. Really appreciate the time that you spent. Thank you so much.
Okay. Cheers.
And for everybody else, unless there are any other topics of conversation for the good of the group, and you're free to go. We just gave you back 10 minutes of your life.
there you go. And if you're looking for ways to access the information that's in that AZ Ledge system, feel free